And now I'll hand over to Melissa Atchison, who is moderating our next session. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that. My name is Melissa Atchison. I'll be moderating this next session. I am the Research and Extension Specialist with Manitoba Beef Producers, and I also have a ranch with my family in Southwest Manitoba. Quick reminder, questions, please direct those to the Q&A function, not in the chat. Questions posted in the chat will not be addressed. And as Sarah just said, CEU and CCA QR codes will be posted after each session. So firstly, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Helen Baulch. She is the Associate Professor at the School of Environment and Sustainability and Global Institute for Water Security, University of Saskatchewan. Her work focuses on causes and consequences of excess nutrients in aquatic ecosystems, and her group works to identify pragmatic options, excuse me, to manage agricultural nutrients and support research on cold regions processes, including VMP suited to the prairie context. Her work also spans aquatic ecosystems impacted by high nutrients and challenging climate, studying the cycling of nutrients within lakes, impacts of blooms within lakes, and adaptation and mitigation needs. I'll leave it at that, as she has asked me to keep her intro brief. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Helen.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Just toggling my mute button as per Zoom tradition. So first, thanks for the opportunity to speak today, and to the organizers and speakers who preceded. It's been a really diverse and really engaging, inspiring conversation so far. So I'm really looking forward to what follows here. So starting my talk with gratitude, I wanted to express gratitude for a large number of people who have really informed my thinking on water quality and on agriculture, particularly in the prairies, as well as funding agencies who've made the work that we do possible. I also want to acknowledge I'm on Treaty 6 land in the homeland of the Métis, and I'll be speaking about research that spans a lot of the prairies. And I'll say personally, I am a newcomer to the prairies, coming from Ontario, and really Treaty 72 waters have informed who I am as a water quality scientist. So gratitude there as well. So my goal for today is to take you through a few things that you probably already know into a discussion about ways we can start to try to reduce some areas of water-related risk. So I'm going to tell you it only takes a tiny amount of phosphorus to turn a lake green and really impact ecosystem services we need from water. I'm going to tell you we have pretty serious water quality issues, and many of you will have firsthand life experience with that. And then again, moving forward. So I always argue that nutrient pollution is the greatest water quality challenge in Canada and indeed globally. Others may note other water quality issues, and certainly there are many important water quality issues, but this is a really big one. Many of you are familiar with the issues of Lake Winnipeg or Lake Erie, but there are thousands of smaller lakes in Canada that are similarly affected by nutrient pollution issues. Now, the problem, many of you will be aware, relates to phosphorus, and this is the way it's typically framed. Excess phosphorus impacts the ecology of lakes, and the key thing is that lakes respond to tiny, tiny amounts of phosphorus, parts per billion quantities that cause issues like you see in the image here of blooms and eutrophication broadly. Now, I've moved towards trying to frame the problem a little bit differently, and that's that it's a problem actually with lakes. So the problem is lakes are incredibly sensitive to phosphorus, and the other problem is, as much as I would like to talk to lakes about that incredible sensitivity, they're not going to change. So we need to adapt our management knowing just how incredibly sensitive they are. And I presented this work to an ag audience about a year ago, and I had someone approach me afterwards and say, hold on a second, you're saying it takes 1.5 to 2 kilograms of phosphorus per week, and in a few months' time, you've got these bloom issues started. And I said, yes. And he said, you know, that's the amount that I might spill when I'm loading my equipment, and I don't bother to clean that up. And I said, yes, I know it's a tiny amount in an agronomic context, but it's enough to really impact these ecosystems. The other problem we face is the fact that we've known this since the 1970s. We've known this since before I was born. So this is an old and really challenging environmental problem, and there are many of them when we think about sustainability problems and environmental problems. And this term is also derives from the 1970s, and this is the concept of a wicked problem, which is a problem that we may never solve, we will never solve. And nutrient pollution is one of these because there's no clear solution. It's incredibly place-based, and certainly we know it sits astride the responsibilities of many organizations. So as we think about water quality and nutrient management and sustainability as a whole, this is a really useful, somewhat discouraging concept that tells us we've got lots and lots of work ahead and conversations needed. So if we move to my next goal, which is that articulating that we have serious water quality issues. I'm going to lean on headlines, not science papers here, but many of you will know from reading the newspaper or even visiting nearby lakes that we've got serious issues. Ones that hit national news in recent years were when the Pope visited Lac St. Anne and there was a major algal bloom afoot. And then more locally, Little Manitou Lake had a very serious bloom a couple years back. And that's a really important economic issue here, as well as cultural issue, because that is considered a sacred lake by many. So what's the issue with blooms? Again, this will be familiar to many. Certainly there's many impacts on an ecosystem, on fish, on the ecology, but the key thing that captures headlines is that if you were to consume water from a bloom that was untreated, that could be fatal. So there are very, very serious health consequences associated with this. Impacts on humans are certainly very rare, but we do see frequent issues of fatalities to animals. So major concerns in agriculture. So the summary so far is we have problems, and that a large part of this issue is that lakes are really too sensitive. So if we think about how to move forward to try to reduce risk, the first thing I want to emphasize is that producers are actually typically doing a very good job managing nutrient balances. So this is a slide from my colleague Jane Elliott, and it shows field scale inputs and outputs of phosphorus over multiple years. And the key thing is the thing that we need to manage better to help protect lakes is a thing you can't even see on the slide in many years, which is a little purple bar, which describes their runoff loss. So the runoff loss is a very small proportion of field scale budgets, but at the same time, because of that incredible sensitivity of lakes, it's enough to really cause these problems. Now, one thing I really do want to emphasize as we talk about sustainability in agriculture and some of the changes we've made that have been really beneficial is that every change we make has a trade-off, and all of those trade-offs in this landscape seem to be piling onto water quality. So reduced tillage is an incredibly beneficial practice to many producers, to soil moisture. It has had a very negative impact on water quality because phosphorus stratifies in the surface soils, and phosphorus in tissue residues is vulnerable to export. So that practice is here to stay, but certainly a concern. Similarly, cover crops can also have negative impacts on water quality. In the Saskatchewan context, drainage policy is advancing, and there is extensive drainage in our landscape. And our work really does show there's a very significant impact that we can anticipate on water quality associated with this increased drainage. So all of these practices have agronomic, economic, soil health benefits, but we do need to be mindful of these impacts on water quality. So in a working landscape, and certainly one where there's so many pressures on producers to adapt, we need pragmatic solutions, and we need ones that we're working towards, and then we need ones that we can act on now. And just to emphasize, we need to be mindful of the fact that all of these solutions that we're implementing have trade-offs, and including some of the nature-based solutions like cover crops and reduced tillage that can impact water quality. So in the context of reduced tillage, certainly we have had rapid adoption. It's been very beneficial in many ways. What can we do for water quality? Some of the ideas suggest that rotational tillage might help, or changing nutrient management just to be really careful to keep the nutrients below the soil surface as much as we can. In terms of wetland drainage, I wish I had a good piece of advice or a solution for this one. Flow control can help manage erosion. Strategic protection of some wetlands can help. And we might enter a time where we start to think about, chemical amendments and bioreactors, but that's really challenging, at least in terms of prairie hydrology and runoff. The key advice is and has been keeping water on the land, and that's not always popular advice. When we think about easy wins in our landscape, certainly I think Manitoba has shown some great leadership on manure management and avoiding winter application. Winter application is pretty rare, but when we think about that incredible sensitivity of lakes and the fact that so much of that manure runs off, that's an easy win if we can prevent winter application of manure. And certainly there's work that could be done at a policy level in Canada to advance that. There's advice about management of livestock that can be beneficial, but the key thing I want to dive a little bit deeper into is some of our decisions on nutrient management. And I think a key question I have is, are we actually suggesting the right rate? And do we know what that is right now? We know agronomic recommendations are relatively old, very old, they're decades old. And in the time since those agronomic recommendations were developed, we have new varieties, new practices, and in the prairies, we have new science saying there's really no amount of soil phosphorus that's safe for runoff. We want to manage that as low as we can. So when we think about soil phosphorus or our application recommendations for crop yields, we probably don't want to recommend a little bit extra for those years, because in many years that phosphorus isn't going to be used, could accumulate, and certainly does contribute to runoff losses. Now, a few years back, we held a workshop to help bridge some of the narratives we've heard around phosphorus management in the landscape. There's narratives of declining phosphorus and phosphorus shortages, and then the narrative I just gave you about environmental risk. And some key things we heard from participants were that most agreed we could improve agronomic phosphorus management for water quality, as well as for crop production, and more than 3/4 thought we could do that jointly. So I think that's very promising. Another key question was about 60% said it's probably time to revise those phosphorus recommendations for crop producers. So as I move towards closing, I'll emphasize that poor water quality is really expensive. The water treatment plant I work with is investing $300 million to upgrade their treatment to address the water quality challenges they face. And depending on how you want to generate those numbers, they're big numbers in the millions or billions of dollars in terms of the water quality impacts. There's also substantial public pressure to address water quality issues, and an indicator of, public caring is their willingness to pay. And there is evidence, at least in parts of Canada, there's significant willingness to invest in water quality solutions. Poor water quality is also really difficult to remediate. So it means once we've got a problem, it can be decades to get back to where we want to go. And we know that increased water temperatures and changes in runoff are adding to these issues. So we really do need to be as proactive as we can. So to really close off today and pass off to our next speaker, I just want to emphasize that these issues, knowledge of these issues is really far from universal. And some of the things we need to address are narratives about, there's no runoff in our landscape, or that phosphorus is fixed in soils, because there's enough runoff of phosphorus to really have an impact. When we think about managing our own landscapes, there are lots of interventions that do work and narratives that can influence producers and change in our landscapes. But we do need to be mindful of the solutions we're implementing and the trade-offs associated with those. I'll just reiterate that I think agronomic phosphorus recommendations could benefit from an update that would really help on a lot of the water quality issues we're facing. And then that I do think pragmatic solutions for the working landscapes we have across the country really are achievable. And right now, there's a lot of rapid change associated with the need for climate adaptation, supply chain constraints, and social license to farm. And that makes it a bit of a scary space in many ways for producers. There's so much change underway, but I think there's so many opportunities to support change and support decision making. So with that, I'll thank you, and I'll look forward to questions, comments, and the conversations that hopefully will follow here.
Thank you for that, Helen. That was excellent. Just as a reminder, please post your questions, direct them to the Q&A portion and not the chat. It just makes it much easier for us as moderators to find them and have them addressed for you. We will have, after the presentations run consecutively, we'll have a 15-minute break, and then we'll return to have our full time for 45 minutes, I believe, a nice discussion with the panelists where you'll be able to interact and ask your questions, and your questions that are posted in the Q&A will be asked for you.